Sometimes the job that saves your child is the one that breaks your heart first. The rain had been falling since dawn, turning the streets of Portland into shimmering ribbons of gray as Emily Carter stood outside St. Matthew Children's Hospital clutching a folded envelope that weighed less than an ounce but felt heavier than the entire world. Inside was the estimate for Lily's surgery, $48,600. Even after insurance, the remaining balance might as well have been $1 million. Emily slipped the paper back into her worn canvas bag before her 6-year-old daughter could notice the tears gathering in her eyes. Lily skipped beside her in a faded yellow raincoat, humming quietly and holding a stuffed rabbit whose ears had been sewn back together more times than Emily could count. "Mom, are we still getting pancakes on Saturday?" Lily asked with a hopeful smile. Emily smiled back despite the ache in her chest. "Of course we are, sweetheart." She didn't know how. She barely had enough money to keep the lights on through the weekend. By noon she was sitting in the waiting room of another employment agency, one of 5 she had visited that week. Her phone buzzed with another overdue rent reminder. She silenced it without reading the message. Across the room, people in press suits scrolled through job listings while Emily quietly mended a loose button on her coat using a tiny sewing kit she carried everywhere. She had once worked as a certified nursing assistant at a rehabilitation center, until budget cuts erased half the staff. Since then, she had cleaned motel rooms, stocked grocery shelves overnight, and delivered meals across the city, piecing together enough hours to survive but never enough to breathe. "Emily Carter?" a woman called from behind a glass office door. Emily stood immediately. The recruiter smiled politely before sliding a folder across the desk. "This position isn't listed publicly. It pays significantly more than standard caregiving work." Emily looked at the hourly rate and blinked twice, convinced she had misread it. It was nearly 4 times what she had ever earned. "Why?" she asked carefully. The recruiter hesitated before answering. "Because almost everyone quits." Emily remained silent. "The client is Ethan Harrison. He's 39, founder and CEO of Harrison Medical Group. After a car accident 2 years ago, he became paralyzed from the waist down. He requires private in-home assistance." Emily nodded slowly. That sounded difficult but not impossible. Then the recruiter lowered her voice. "There is one condition." Emily waited. "You will be responsible for his daily personal care, including bathing, dressing, and physical assistance. Mr. Harrison refuses to rotate caregivers. If you accept, you must agree to complete confidentiality. No photos. No interviews. No discussions about his condition. To the outside world, you don't work there." The room became impossibly quiet. Emily looked down at the contract but couldn't focus on the words. She imagined Lily asleep beneath 3 blankets because the apartment heater barely worked. She imagined another hospital bill arriving. She imagined telling her daughter that the surgery would have to wait. Slowly she picked up the pen. Her hand trembled only once before she signed her name. The recruiter closed the folder with a soft click. "Transportation will arrive tomorrow morning at 8. "One more thing," she said gently. "Mr. Harrison has one unusual request." Emily looked up. "Every mirror in his bedroom must remain covered before he wakes. He refuses to see his own reflection." The wrought iron gates opened without a sound, revealing a lakeside estate so quiet that even the fountain seemed afraid to make noise. Emily tightened her grip on her canvas bag as the black sedan rolled slowly along the curved driveway lined with towering maple trees, whose leaves danced gently in the crisp Oregon breeze. The mansion looked less like a home and more like a private museum. All stone walls, towering windows, and perfect gardens untouched by laughter. A middle-aged house manager named Margaret greeted her at the entrance with a warm but tired smile. "Thank you for coming, Miss Carter. We have been expecting you." Emily stepped inside and immediately noticed what was missing. There were no family photographs. No music. No scent of fresh coffee. Only polished marble floors and the distant ticking of an antique grandfather clock that echoed through the enormous hallway. Margaret spoke softly as they walked upstairs. "Mr. Harrison dismissed 6 caregivers in the past 8 months. Emily looked surprised. "Did they make mistakes?" Margaret hesitated before answering. "No. They simply could not reach him. They stopped outside a pair of dark oak doors." Margaret lowered her voice even further. "Please remember one thing. Never offer sympathy. He dislikes pity more than pain. Emily nodded slowly. Before opening the door, Margaret reached toward a velvet curtain hanging over an enormous mirror and carefully adjusted it so not a single inch of glass remained visible. Emily remembered the recruiter's final warning. Every mirror had to stay covered. Margaret knocked once. No answer. She knocked again. A deep voice finally broke the silence. Come in. The room overlooked the lake through floor-to-ceiling windows where gray clouds reflected across the water. Books filled one wall. Medical journals covered another. Everything was perfectly organized except for a wheelchair positioned beside the window. Ethan Harrison sat facing the lake with his back toward the door. He wore a simple navy sweater instead of the expensive suits Emily had expected from one of the country's youngest billionaires. Without turning around, he asked, "Which number are you?" Emily blinked. "I am sorry? Caregiver number 7? His voice remained calm, almost emotionless. Margaret answered quietly, "This is Emily Carter, sir." Ethan let out a humorless laugh. "Tell the agency not to bother sending number 8. Emily could have stayed silent. Every instinct told her to leave the conversation there. Instead, she stepped forward one careful pace. "You have not met me yet." Ethan slowly turned his chair until their eyes met for the first time. His face carried the confidence of someone who had once commanded boardrooms with a single sentence, but beneath that confidence rested an exhaustion that reached far deeper than sleepless nights. "I already know how this ends," he said evenly. "You will spend 2 days pretending I am not difficult. By Friday you will apologize. By next week someone else will stand where you are." Emily did not answer immediately. She simply noticed the unopened breakfast tray resting on a nearby table, the coffee already cold, and the physical therapy equipment gathering dust in the corner. "Would you like me to bring you fresh coffee?" she asked. Ethan frowned slightly, almost confused by the question. "Did you hear anything I just said?" Emily offered a small smile. "Every word. But your coffee is cold." For the first time in what Margaret later realized had been months, Ethan had no immediate reply. The silence lingered between them, not uncomfortable but unfamiliar. Then his eyes drifted briefly toward the covered mirror before returning to the window. "You will learn," he said quietly. "Everyone eventually walks away." Emily looked at the untouched breakfast, then back at the lonely man staring across the lake. "Maybe," she answered gently, "but I have not left today." Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft reflections across the polished hardwood floor as Emily arranged fresh towels on a nearby chair, exactly the way Margaret had shown her. The room remained silent except for the distant call of birds over the lake and the quiet hum of the heating system. Ethan sat beside the window reading financial reports on a tablet, his expression unreadable. He never looked toward the covered mirrors, and Emily noticed that even the polished silver picture frames had been turned face down. Every reflective surface had quietly disappeared from his world. Margaret approached Emily before leaving the room and whispered, "This is usually when they resign." Emily gave a puzzled smile. "Because of the morning routine?" Margaret nodded gently. "Because they focus on what he cannot do instead of asking what he would like to do." Emily watched Margaret leave before walking toward Ethan. She stopped several feet away, careful not to invade his space. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison." Without lifting his eyes from the tablet, he replied, "You are still here." "I said I would be." Another long silence settled between them before Emily continued in the same calm voice she had used with anxious patience years earlier. "Whenever you are ready, I can help you begin your morning routine." Ethan finally looked up. His blue eyes searched her face, almost waiting for hesitation or discomfort. Instead, he found neither. "Do they teach that voice in nursing school?" he asked. Emily smiled faintly. "No. My daughter taught me patience." Ethan set the tablet aside with a quiet sigh. "You understand what this job involves?" "Yes. Most people change their minds when reality arrives." Emily answered honestly. "Reality has never frightened me as much as unpaid medical bills." Something flickered across Ethan's face before disappearing almost instantly. He looked away toward the lake. "There are clean clothes in the closet." Emily nodded. Before taking another step, she asked, "May I come closer?" The question surprised him enough that he answered after several seconds. Yes. She moved carefully, explaining each step before she performed it. I am going to position the chair. I am locking the wheels now. I am placing a towel here so you will be more comfortable. Her movements were practiced, respectful, and unhurried. There was no pity in her expression and no awkwardness in her voice. Only professionalism mixed with quiet kindness. Ethan noticed something unusual. She never looked away in embarrassment, yet she never stared either. She treated him exactly as she would have treated anyone needing assistance. At one point he asked quietly, "Does this make you uncomfortable?" Emily paused only long enough to answer truthfully, "No. But I imagine it makes you uncomfortable." Ethan released a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding. No caregiver had ever answered that way. Most insisted everything was fine while carefully avoiding his eyes. Others apologized for things that required no apology. Emily simply acknowledged his dignity without pretending his struggle did not exist. As the routine continued, she noticed a framed photograph resting inside an open drawer. It showed Ethan standing beside dozens of hospital volunteers years earlier, smiling with genuine warmth. The man in the photograph seemed lighter somehow, almost impossible to reconcile with the quiet figure before her. She gently closed the drawer without mentioning it. Several minutes later, after everything was finished, Emily stepped back and straightened the blanket across his lap. "Would you like your coffee now?" she asked. Ethan stared at her for a long moment before giving the smallest nod. "Fresh this time," he said quietly. As Emily walked toward the kitchen, Margaret watched from the hallway with disbelief. For the first time since the accident, an entire morning had passed without a raised voice, a dismissed caregiver, or a closed bedroom door. Ethan remained by the window holding a warm cup of coffee, but instead of staring at the lake, he found himself watching the young single mother quietly preparing breakfast as though she had somehow brought a little life back into a house that had forgotten how to breathe. The steady rhythm of rain tapping against the windows returned 3 days later, blending with the quiet crackle of the fireplace that barely warmed the enormous living room. Emily had already learned the strange routine of the mansion. Breakfast was always served at 7. Business calls filled the morning. Physical therapy appointments remained untouched on the calendar. Every evening the lights stayed on until long after midnight because Ethan rarely slept more than 2 hours at a time. She never asked why. She simply noticed. Late that afternoon she carried a tray into his study with homemade chicken soup, instead of the expensive catered meals the kitchen staff usually prepared. Ethan glanced at the bowl with mild suspicion. "This is different." Emily smiled. "The chef had the afternoon off. I asked Margaret if I could cook." He looked at the steam rising from the bowl. "You think soup fixes everything?" "No," Emily replied softly. "But cold soup definitely fixes nothing." To her surprise, the corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly before he picked up the spoon. Margaret nearly dropped a stack of folded linens when she witnessed the moment from the hallway. It was the closest thing to a smile anyone had seen from him in nearly 2 years. That evening, Emily stepped onto the back porch during her break and opened her aging phone. The screen was cracked across one corner, but the video call connected anyway. Lily appeared wrapped in her favorite blanket at their neighbor Mrs. Dawson's apartment. "Mom, guess what?" Lily exclaimed with excitement. "I got 100% on my spelling test." Emily clapped her hands. "I knew you would." Lily held the paper close to the camera before lowering her voice. "Are you eating enough?" Emily laughed gently. "I could ask you the same question." "Mrs. Dawson made macaroni." "Then I know you are doing just fine." Ethan happened to pass the hallway leading toward the library and paused when he heard laughter drifting in from the porch. It sounded unfamiliar inside the mansion, almost out of place. Without meaning to eavesdrop, he caught only fragments of the conversation. "I miss you too. Only a few more days. Be brave for me." When Emily ended the call, she remained outside for another minute, staring across the lake while quietly wiping away tears before taking a slow breath and returning inside with the same calm smile she always wore. Ethan pretended to continue reading when she entered the study again. "Everything all right?" he asked without looking up. Emily nodded. "My daughter likes pretending everything is an adventure. Even this. Especially this." She says heroes have difficult jobs. Ethan looked at the financial report in front of him but realized he had not read a single line. Children believe impossible things. Emily adjusted the blanket over his legs before answering. Sometimes they remind adults which impossible things are worth believing. The words lingered in the room long after she walked away. Later that night, Ethan wheeled himself through the quiet hallway and noticed a forgotten notebook resting on the kitchen counter. It belonged to Emily. He intended only to return it, but a folded page slipped free. On it was a handwritten budget filled with crossed-out expenses. New shoes had been replaced with Lily's medicine. Winter coat had been replaced with hospital savings. Coffee had been replaced with bus fare. At the very bottom beneath, dozens of careful calculations, one sentence had been written in neat blue ink. Never let Lily see you give up. Ethan quietly folded the page exactly as he had found it and placed the notebook back where it belonged. Then, for the first time since the accident, he looked toward the dusty physical therapy room across the hallway and did not immediately turn away. The following Monday began with an unusual request. Margaret handed Emily a neatly pressed navy jacket and smiled with cautious optimism. Mr. Harrison has agreed to attend the quarterly board meeting in person. Emily looked toward the study in surprise. That is good news. Margaret nodded. It would be, if this were not his first appearance in almost a year. The drive to Harrison Medical Group headquarters took just under 40 minutes. Yet the silence inside the luxury sedan felt much longer. Ethan reviewed financial reports while Emily sat quietly beside him, answering only when he asked a question. As the city skyline came into view, she noticed him unconsciously adjusting the cuff of his sweater, not out of vanity but out of nervous habit. The towering glass headquarters reflected the cloudy morning sky, and employees instinctively stood straighter as the car arrived beneath the covered entrance. Although Ethan greeted everyone politely, Emily sensed something she had never expected from one of the country's most successful executives. He was not afraid of business. He was watching people. Every smile, every handshake, every glance lingered a fraction longer than normal, as though he no longer trusted the room around him. During the meeting, Emily remained outside the conference room with Margaret, organizing paperwork while executives entered one by one. Most offered respectful greetings, but one man caught her attention. Daniel Whitmore, the company's chief operating officer, smiled warmly at everyone he passed. His tailored suit was flawless, his voice calm, his manners impeccable. Yet when he noticed Ethan through the conference room glass, the warmth disappeared for only an instant before returning again. The change lasted less than a second, but Emily saw it. Later that afternoon, the meeting ended successfully. Investors appeared satisfied, and Ethan had handled every discussion with quiet authority. As employees filtered out, Emily gathered several folders left behind on the conference table. One thin envelope had slipped beneath a chair. She picked it up, assuming someone had forgotten it, but before she could call after anyone, a folded document slid partially into view. She only intended to identify its owner. Instead, her eyes caught a single sentence highlighted in yellow. Contingency succession plan following permanent executive incapacity. Emily frowned. Ethan had never mentioned stepping down. Curious only because she needed to return the envelope correctly, she glanced at the signature page. Daniel Whitmore's name appeared repeatedly beside confidential legal amendments dated just 3 weeks after Ethan's accident. Before she could read another line, footsteps approached. Emily quickly returned the papers to the envelope. Daniel entered with the same polished smile. "Thank you," he said pleasantly. "I was looking for that." Emily handed it to him. It slipped under the chair. These meetings become rather hectic. His tone remained friendly, yet his fingers tightened around the envelope almost instantly. "Did you happen to read anything?" Emily answered honestly. Only enough to recognize it was confidential. His smile never faded, but his eyes became impossible to read. Discretion is an admirable quality. After he walked away, Emily noticed he never looked back toward the conference room. He walked directly to a private elevator that required executive authorization. On the drive home, Ethan seemed unusually exhausted. "How did it go?" Emily asked as the city disappeared behind them. "The numbers were excellent," he replied quietly. "The room was not." Emily remembered the subtle change in Daniel's expression and the strange document mentioning Ethan's incapacity. She considered asking about it but remained silent. That evening she delivered tea to Ethan's study and found him asleep in his wheelchair with a file resting across his lap. A single photograph had slipped onto the floor. It showed the mangled remains of a luxury sedan beside a rain-soaked mountain road taken the night of his accident. Written across the back in black ink were 6 words that made Emily's heartbeat slow to a stop. Brake system inspection report permanently sealed by order. The photograph remained in Emily's thoughts long after she carefully returned it to the folder exactly where she had found it. She never mentioned the handwritten note, never asked questions, and never searched through another file again. Whatever had happened on that rain-soaked mountain road belonged to Ethan's past, and she respected that boundary. Still, one feeling refused to leave her. Someone had wanted certain answers to remain buried. The following afternoon, a small white envelope appeared beside her handbag in the staff entrance. There was no stamp, no name, only a single folded sheet of paper inside. In neat block letters it read, "Some people are impossible to save. Walk away while you still can." Emily stared at the sentence for several seconds before quietly folding the paper and slipping it into her pocket. Margaret noticed the change in her expression almost immediately. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Emily forced a reassuring smile. "Probably just someone playing a strange joke." Margaret did not look convinced, but she nodded without pressing further. Emily finished preparing Ethan's afternoon tea and entered the study as she always did. Sunlight reflected across the lake, filling the room with soft gold instead of the usual gray. Ethan looked up from a stack of reports. "You are quieter today." Emily placed the cup beside him. "Just thinking." He studied her face for a moment. "Thinking about leaving?" The question surprised her. "No. Everyone reaches that point eventually." Emily looked toward the covered mirror before answering. "Maybe they leave because they think you want them to." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Do not confuse distance with preference." Emily folded her hands calmly. "Then tell me honestly, do you want everyone to stay away?" He did not answer immediately. Outside, a gentle breeze stirred the trees along the shoreline. Finally he spoke so quietly she almost missed it. "When people see what I lost, they stop seeing who I am." Emily nodded slowly. "Then they are looking at the wrong thing." Ethan lowered his eyes. "You make that sound simple." "It is not simple," she replied. "It is a choice." The silence between them felt different now. Less guarded. More honest. After several moments, Ethan asked the question he had apparently been carrying for days. "Why are you still here?" Emily smiled faintly. "Because I accepted a job." He shook his head. "No. There are easier jobs." She thought about Lily sleeping each night with her worn stuffed rabbit. She thought about the notebook filled with impossible numbers. Then she looked directly at him. "When I lost my husband, people stopped talking to me like I was Emily. I became the widow with the little girl. Everywhere I went, people saw the tragedy first." Ethan remained perfectly still. Emily continued softly. "You told me people only see what you lost. I know what that feels like." He looked out toward the lake again, but this time there was no bitterness in his expression, only quiet reflection. "You never told me that. You never asked." A faint smile crossed his face before disappearing again. "Fair enough." Later that evening, Emily prepared to leave for the night when she noticed the physical therapy room door standing open. For weeks it had remained untouched. Inside, the exercise equipment had been cleaned, the therapy mat unrolled, and the parallel bars adjusted to their proper height. She turned as she heard the gentle sound of wheelchair wheels behind her. Ethan stopped beside the doorway without looking at her. "Call the therapist tomorrow morning," he said quietly. Emily blinked in surprise. "Are you certain?" He watched the fading sunlight stretch across the empty room. "No," he admitted honestly. "But I think it is time I stopped letting the accident make every decision for me." The physical therapist arrived at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning carrying nothing more than a clipboard, a quiet smile, and years of experience helping people rediscover hope one difficult step at a time. Dr. Rebecca Collins had worked with Ethan during the first months after his accident, but after countless canceled appointments she had eventually stopped calling. When she saw him waiting beside the therapy room instead of inside his office, genuine surprise crossed her face. "It is good to see you again, Ethan," she said warmly. He nodded once. "Do not make too much of it." Rebecca smiled knowingly. "I have learned not to celebrate before the work begins." Emily quietly prepared water bottles and fresh towels before stepping back. She knew this was not her moment to lead. It was her moment to remain present. The first exercises appeared almost effortless to an outside observer. Gentle stretches, controlled breathing, slow upper body movements. Yet Emily noticed tiny beads of perspiration forming along Ethan's forehead long before the session reached the standing exercises. Rebecca adjusted the support harness attached to the parallel bars and looked him in the eyes. "Only if you are ready." Ethan stared at the polished wooden floor for several seconds. "I have been ready for 2 years," he answered quietly. "I simply forgot why." With careful guidance, he positioned his hands on the rails. Every movement demanded concentration. Muscles that had not carried his weight in years trembled from the effort. Emily instinctively took one small step forward before stopping herself. Rebecca had everything under control. Ethan drew one slow breath and pushed upward. For a brief moment nothing happened. Then inch by inch his shoulders rose. His arms tightened. His body lifted until he stood supported by the bars, unsteady but unmistakably upright. The room became completely silent. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the lake beyond as though the world itself had paused to witness the moment. Ethan kept his eyes fixed ahead. "How long?" he asked through controlled breathing. Rebecca glanced at her watch. 7 seconds. Ethan lowered himself back into the wheelchair with quiet determination rather than disappointment. "Tomorrow," he said. Rebecca smiled. "Tomorrow." Over the following weeks, the therapy room slowly transformed from a forgotten space into the busiest room in the mansion. Some days lasted only 15 minutes before exhaustion ended the session. Other days brought small victories measured in seconds instead of miles. Emily never praised progress too quickly. Instead, she simply placed fresh water beside him after each exercise and treated every improvement as another ordinary part of the day. One afternoon, Ethan noticed a colorful drawing attached to the refrigerator with a small magnet. Crayon flowers surrounded 3 smiling figures beneath a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, Lily had written in careful handwriting, "Heroes keep trying." Ethan studied the picture for a long time. "She sent this?" he asked. Emily nodded with a smile. "She wanted to decorate your kitchen because she thinks hospitals should never look gloomy." Ethan laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar even to himself. "This is not a hospital. She says healing can happen anywhere." That evening, after Emily left for home, Ethan wheeled himself back into the therapy room alone. The parallel bars stood waiting in the fading light. He looked at Lily's drawing, which Emily had quietly placed on a nearby shelf, then rested both hands firmly on the rails. No therapist counted. No audience watched. There was only silence, determination, and the memory of a little girl who believed heroes kept trying. Across the hallway, Margaret noticed the light still glowing beneath the therapy room door long after sunset. She smiled to herself because she understood something no medical report could ever measure. Emily had not restored movement to Ethan's legs. She had restored a reason for him to stand. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees around the lake in deep shades of amber and crimson, while a cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the open windows of the mansion. The therapy sessions continued every morning, and although Ethan still relied on his wheelchair throughout most of the day, something far more important had changed. His calendar was full again. Meetings returned. Decisions returned. Even laughter, though still rare, had found its way back into rooms that had once echoed only with silence. Emily noticed the difference in countless small ways. He finished his meals. He asked about Lily's spelling tests. He even requested fresh flowers for the dining room because, as he quietly admitted, the house no longer felt like a place waiting to be abandoned. Then everything shifted on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Emily had stopped by headquarters to deliver medical paperwork that Ethan had forgotten before an executive meeting. Margaret directed her to a private conference floor where the board had gathered behind closed doors. As she waited outside, She noticed Daniel Whitmore speaking in a low voice with the company's general counsel near an office whose door had been left slightly open. Emily had no intention of listening, but one sentence drifted clearly into the hallway. If Harrison refuses to sign before the annual vote, we proceed without him. Another voice answered nervously. What if the old investigation is reopened? Daniel's reply came without hesitation. It never will be. The inspection report disappeared years ago. Emily froze. Her thoughts rushed back to the photograph, the sealed break report, and the confidential succession documents she had accidentally seen weeks earlier. Before she could quietly step away, Daniel opened the office door and found her standing in the hallway holding Ethan's folder. For the briefest instant, surprise crossed his face before the familiar polished smile returned. "Miss Carter," he said pleasantly, "you certainly seem to appear at interesting moments." Emily remained calm. "I was delivering paperwork." Daniel accepted the explanation with a courteous nod, yet his voice grew softer. Loyal employees often find themselves carrying burdens that do not belong to them. Life becomes much simpler when people focus only on their assigned responsibilities. Emily met his gaze without flinching. "Taking care of people is my responsibility." Daniel smiled once more. "I hope you continue doing exactly that." He walked away with perfect composure, but Emily understood the message beneath his words. It was not a threat spoken aloud. It was a warning wrapped in impeccable manners. That evening she debated whether to tell Ethan everything she had overheard. As she entered the library, she found him reviewing documents related to the company's upcoming shareholder meeting. He immediately noticed the concern in her expression. "Something happened today." Emily slowly told him about the conversation outside the conference room without exaggeration or accusation. She repeated only the words she had actually heard. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he remained silent for a long time before opening a locked drawer in his desk. Inside rested a thin folder labeled Mountain Pass Investigation. He looked at it before quietly closing the drawer again. "For 2 years I convinced myself that accepting unanswered questions was easier than searching for painful answers," he said. "I believed surviving the accident was enough." Emily stood beside the window overlooking the dark lake. "Do you still believe that?" Ethan slowly shook his head. "No. Because surviving is no longer the only thing I want." He wheeled himself toward the therapy room instead of ending the conversation. Rebecca happened to be finishing paperwork nearby and looked up in surprise. Ethan rested both hands on the parallel bars, drew one steady breath, and pushed himself upward. His legs trembled under the strain, but this time he remained standing several seconds longer than ever before. He was not standing to prove the doctors wrong. He was not standing to impress a board of directors. He was standing because for the first time since that rainy night in the mountains, he had decided that the truth was worth facing, no matter how difficult the next step might be. 1 year later, the first warm days of spring returned to the lake, carrying the sound of children laughing across the gardens where silence had once ruled every corner of the estate. The mansion had changed, but not because of new furniture or expensive renovations. The mirrors were no longer covered. Fresh flowers stood beside every window. Music drifted softly through the halls each morning, and the dining room was finally used for conversations instead of lonely meals. Ethan still relied on his wheelchair for much of the day, although with the help of therapy, he could now stand for short periods using support when necessary. He no longer measured his life by how many steps he could take. He measured it by how many lives he could help move forward. The company's independent legal review had quietly uncovered long-hidden irregularities surrounding the accident investigation and several unauthorized corporate decisions made afterward. Faced with documented evidence and financial records, Daniel Whitmore resigned before the annual shareholder meeting concluded, and a new leadership team committed itself to transparency and accountability. Ethan refused to celebrate another person's downfall. Justice should restore trust, he told the board, not satisfy revenge. His first official decision afterward surprised everyone. Harrison Medical Group announced the construction of a nonprofit rehabilitation and family support center, dedicated to helping patients recover with dignity regardless of income. The building would carry only one name, Hope House. When reporters asked why he had chosen such a simple name, Ethan smiled gently. Because hope was the first thing someone gave me when I had nothing else left. Emily had never asked for recognition. She quietly returned to school to complete advanced rehabilitation training while continuing to care for Lily, who had successfully recovered from her surgery, and now ran through life with the limitless energy only children seem to possess. On opening day of the new center, Lily raced across the garden carrying the same patch-stuffed rabbit she had refused to replace, even after Ethan had offered to buy her a new one. "This one already knows all my stories," she had explained. Ethan understood exactly what she meant. Some things became valuable not because they were perfect but because they stayed with us through imperfect days. As guests toured the bright therapy rooms, Emily noticed one familiar detail. Beside every large mirror hung a small wooden plaque engraved with a simple sentence. "Look at who you are, not only what you have lost." She turned toward Ethan with quiet surprise. "That was your idea?" He shook his head. "No." He smiled warmly. "It was inspired by someone who never looked at me with pity." Emily lowered her eyes, touched beyond words. Nearby, Dr. Rebecca Collins watched Lily helping another little girl arrange crayons on a table in the children's activity room. Margaret stood beside the entrance greeting families as though they had always belonged there. The building felt less like a medical center, and more like a place where people remembered they were never meant to heal alone. Before the ceremony ended, Ethan asked Emily if she would join him outside by the lake. The afternoon sunlight shimmered across the calm water exactly as it had on the day they first met. Yet everything felt different now. He rested one hand on the arm of his wheelchair and looked toward the trees where fresh green leaves danced in the breeze. "A year ago I believed my life ended on that mountain road," he said quietly. "I was wrong." Emily smiled. "Sometimes the hardest roads simply lead somewhere we never expected." Ethan nodded. "You came here believing you were saving your daughter." He looked toward Lily, whose laughter echoed across the garden. "You saved far more than that." Emily watched her daughter chasing butterflies beneath the spring sunshine before looking back at the man who had once hidden every mirror inside his home. She realized that neither of them had rescued the other alone. Healing had happened because two broken lives chose kindness before fear, dignity before pride, and hope before despair. And in the quiet reflection of the lake, where no mirror needed to be covered anymore, they both finally recognized the people they had become.